everyone. Welcome to the Self-Agency Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Amanda, and this is a space where we explore, discover, and share tools, techniques, and wisdom to help you build and maintain a sense of agency. Okay, Esther, welcome. I am so honored that you took this time to spark this conversation and dive into these things with me. I first met you at a retreat that we did with Danelle Jones, and I just remember meeting you and being like, how can such a unicorn exist and be so embodied? And I was just in awe of you from the first moment that I met you. I had never seen someone who was so in touch with the sustainability side of things and having conversations around neurodiversity and still being so embodied in the sense of really owning the conversation and speaking from a place of truth. So it was such a
I love hearing that.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was such a wonderful experience. And when I sparked this idea around this podcast, I was like, Esther, absolutely. Please say yes.
Yeah, no, it's very close to my heart. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. Even that little pre-conversation we just had just makes me so excited to see how this unfolds. So I would love to get into a little bit more of your story and mixing in with that what this concept around self-agency means, or even just the concept of agency, how it interweaves into your daily life and how maybe you found that practice or found that concept for yourself.
Okay. Well, I think for me, it's a really interesting question because for me, it's about being comfortable in your own skin. And I work in the education sector. And so a large component of my day-to-day work is actually trying to encourage and instill in others this idea of self-agency. So particularly for our youths, it's interesting for me because I almost feel like it was innate for me. I don't feel like it's necessarily something that I've worked on or developed.
Wow.
But for me, it's almost seeing yourself in a third person, like an observer of yourself from the outside. And often when I speak to others, particularly if they're in a challenging space, it's, how would you advocate for that person that you see?
Oh, wow. Yes.
And another thing is that I think maybe I'm quite a literal person, so I have a very strong bullshit radar, which means that I tend to, when I'm in situations, I'm not good on the kind of small talk and the ability to just fit in and conform. So I think as a person that advocates in the neurodiverse space, it's probably because I also sit in that space, so I'm comfortable with seeing difference and owning that difference as well.
Yeah. Amazing.
And
sorry,
go on.
No, I was just going to say, I would love to dig in more to this neurodiverse because I think this is a term that is getting more and more traction. I think we're talking about it in this more inclusive lens now. So how did that come onto your radar as well when you started? Because let's hear about the dyslexia and the foundations that you're running in that scope and what you're doing in the education system.
Okay. So I originally, I was teaching in the mainstream, and I guess one of the things that we might go on to talk about later as well is, this sense of self. And I think some of the large institutions the systems that we operate within, obviously don't work for everybody. And when I was teaching, I just constantly kind of had this radar of these students that were disengaged, that were really bright and intelligent. We understand that disengagement comes from all manner of challenges that people face, from personality through to trauma. But I guess for me, there was this narrow focus within our education system that didn't fit well with me. It didn't engage from the heart, and it didn't draw out strength and talents that I could see in individuals. And through
Mm.
my own journey of teaching, I really became quite enlightened actually as to what diverse brains and look like, and how we process information is so different from one person to the next. So
Yeah.
the model that we work within in New Zealand is somewhat of a deficit model, which kind of um, we have essentially linear learners, what we would call neurotypical learners who fit the education system. And then we have
Right.
atypical learners that perhaps, highly intelligent, but for whatever reason don't fit the education system, and therefore can't necessarily succeed well within it. And with dyslexia, it's really opened my understanding of, as I say, how people process information. So this invisible world that exists around us, I have a strong radar on now, because I've worked with so many individuals from very young children right through to quite old adults, who
Mm.
have struggled because neurodiversity is, I guess, their barrier. And in terms of what does neurodiversity mean, I think it means different things to different people. In our
Yeah.
education sector in New Zealand, it would look like um, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, lots of dys is in there. Um,
Yeah.
I personally don't see it like that. I see that we're all on a spectrum of some sorts, and I also see gifted and talented sitting in that space as well.
Mm.
So for me, you pointed out, inclusion, and for me, it's all about a strengths model and making it inclusive, because we do tend to focus it on a deficit model.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Mm.
So what has it looked like to be in a system, like the educational system as a whole, and to have this perspective? Because from what I've seen, and I can only speak personally, it's few and far between to have the heart led and the vision to embark on this more inclusive side of things, and actually looking at the strengths and looking at the gifts. So what did it look like to kind of stand in your truth and say, you know what, I'm not going to sink into the system. I'm still going to bring my whole self to the table and start to find different ways to approach this. What was that journey like?
Really challenging, particularly when I was younger, because
Yeah.
I had an education centre from the age of 27, and
Wow.
so I think that I was seen as an outlier, and uh, somebody with less validity, because from the mainstream sector, because I was sitting on the
Mm,
outside. But it was a choice, and it was a choice I made because of that truth that I felt, that I saw individual learners who were just not getting their needs met. So
yeah.
for me, it's been a really interesting journey, one which I've absolutely grown into. I definitely felt intimidated and unsure and uncertain and fearful at times.
Mm,
But my role with the Dyslexia Foundation has very much come about through advocacy, and that high level advocacy. So we were involved in initiating a select committee inquiry, to the Beehive, which basically looks like lots of people throughout the country putting in submissions about
mhm.
their learning needs. And that has since developed into a, a really strong education plan, which is being implemented next year around special
Wow.
education needs. So $260 million being put into that. But this idea that
Mm,
you have to fight, but you have to do it in a way which is mutually beneficial to all. And it's that really challenging space of being assertive and um, having fidelity to the
yeah.
people that you are the voice for, having faith to their needs, um, and trying not to let that be compromised by, the relationships that exist with people. That you have to keep building relationships and sit in this space of disrupting, but disrupting at a level which is comfortable for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so, so profound to hear all the different aspects of it and to have seen and witnessed the way in which you not only conduct yourself, but conduct everything that you're a part of with such grace is awe-inspiring, absolutely. What did that what did it look like to get to that place of not only understanding that you have to fight in a very graceful and compassionate way, but still have that fire? How did you get to a place where you started realizing what that looked like and then keeping your voice and your truth? Do you have any personal practices that you engaged in or kind of a self-discovery that you had to go through? What did that look like to get to a point where you could actually speak that and hold that space?
I think it's it's always having that compass. I've always known my values, and at times
Mm,
those values have been challenged, but not really compromised.
yeah.
So I knew that it was about building and managing my own identity as well, in terms of, that sounds manufactured, but to a degree, we have to manufacture um, our identity so that others can understand what
Mhm.
we're about. And I had to develop and invest in myself as an independent person, I think, in order to kind of steer my own ship, because um, I do live in Queenstown, and as you know, there's not those kind of large or many kind of large corporates or um,
Yeah.
institutions that can invest in you, particularly if you're working in a marginalised space. So I've really had to be resourceful, and
Mm,
I think it's just a case of owning the ambition that you have, but also having enough freedom to be um, free spirited and um, you know the ability to have the strength to know that you can own that process. It kind of
mm,
sounds arrogant, but that idea that um, I haven't had the ability to just kind of sit within a large institution or a large corporate that's investing in me what they want for my personal growth. So it's been about developing that myself. So that freedom, I think, is
right.
incredibly powerful and empowering, because you get to call the shots. You're not owned. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, big time, which
Yeah.
is such a kind of privileged place to be in so many different aspects because when you do get to call the shots and you do get to have the conversations that you want to have, you are steering that ship and you are navigating it in a way that still speaks to a sense of truth.
Mm.
So, when you've been working with others, and I know that agency is a very important thing to you, when you have those conversations with others, what does it look like to actually articulate this to somebody who maybe doesn't understand what agency might necessarily mean and doesn't really understand how to cultivate it within themselves? Have you had those conversations before and what do they look like or what could they look like?
I think it's really a huge area of discovery currently. I think that
Mm,
our education system absolutely fails to develop self agency in the majority of children. Um,
yeah.
that's possibly a sweeping statement, but for the children that I work with, I definitely don't think they're aware of who they are as a person and what their strengths are. So, really, I think
Mm,
it's in its simplest terms, it's the ability to draw out the talent of individuals, to take them
mm,
for who they are, to accept who we are as a person, and um, to 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 be able to use reflective practices about what we enjoy, where our passions lie, and how we can use those within our circle of influence for
mm.
the benefit of ourselves and others. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. It's because that's kind of what it comes down to. Like, there's this concept where we build confidence from the inside out, but I would kind of argue the opposite as well, that confidence does truly come from external as well, and having conversations and kind of seeing the moments when your strengths or the things that you're passionate about or good at are recognized by others, and having those conversations. So I think it is a very collective space to be, and a very, it does need to be safe and nurtured. And it's so wonderful to hear that you're in that arena and that you are having those conversations, because I can't fathom trying to navigate, especially our current political climate, the world that we're living in, without a sense of truth from the inside out, and a sense of what's important, values, morals, boundaries. What has that looked like? So your personal truth and all of these things that we've discussed, what has it looked like to bring it into sustainable Queenstown? Maybe give us some context around sustainable Queenstown.
Sure.
But I can't even imagine being in that arena in the local climate, in the national climate, and then on the global scale. So I would absolutely love, I know that I just did a little flip on us, but there's so much I want to get into with you. So
Mm.
what does that look like?
So, sorry, excuse me. So, Sustainable Queenstown is an organisation that I founded locally, and it was very much a grassroots movement. So, I think it actually stemmed out of self-agency. Um,
Mm,
Self-agency to me is we've touched on strengths, but sometimes we don't know what our strengths are. So the other thing that we need to touch on is courage and being brave,
mm,
being really brave to just say, this is something I believe in. Um, I can see that there's a need for it, because obviously we do have to look at external measures. We could be a force for good or a force for evil, and agency
yeah,
can be very, self-agency
absolutely.
can be powerful in either arena. So I started, I guess, on a personal journey of feeling, as many people do in our current political climate, slightly powerless. Had a lot of passion around how we can look after our local environs, how we can look after people within them, how we can manage the future to a degree, and how we can
Mhm,
have conversations that are challenging and, in some cases, even taboo. So when I kind of started the journey of Sustainable Queenstown, it was very much about, okay, what are some of the issues that I, as an individual who is not working in the sustainability sector, how can I use my circle of influence? Do I have a circle of influence? What does that look like? What do people care about? And how can I get
mhm,
them on board? And, obviously there's lots of people already working in this space. So firstly, it's about connecting with them. And I'm very much a systems thinker, a big picture thinker. So for me, it was about, okay, how can we connect the dots of all these different issues, all these different small not-for-profits that are doing, amazing things in the space of the environment. So it could be reforestation schemes, planting trees. It could be people, passionate about waste. And
mm,
it was about trying to bring people together, but to use their self-agency as a means to create momentum. So,
yeah,
for example, I ran a women's summit, it was all about just celebrating ordinary women doing extraordinary things.
mm,
So this idea that we don't always need to look at outside expertise. We hold a great deal of talent and expertise within our own communities, and
yeah,
if we don't look within, it means that we can't find our pathway, we can't find our route to our solutions, because we actually have to take ownership of it. If we're constantly externalizing solutions, we can't find you know our end point and our pathway to that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my journey with Sustainable Queenstown has been very much about saying, okay, what can I do as an individual that is meaningful to me, i.e., it will be rewarding for me. Not so much what's in it for me, that's a very different
Yeah. Yeah.
question, but more how can I gain satisfaction and feel like I'm achieving the goal and the wish that I want. So,
Mm.
I was lying awake at night worrying about all manner of things, and rather than that, letting that kind of eat away at me, it's like, okay, well, as an individual, I can do something. So, what does that look like? And so, really, I just started to scope that out. So, I did have a plan.
Mm.
It's morphed, it's evolved, of course, but it was about, okay, what can I do in order to ensure that the practical side of my life, I can gain enough income, I can create enough time so that I can manage my
Mhm.
time to give to the community, because I chose to build an organization from grassroots, which has been obviously
Hmm.
challenging, particularly in terms of its financial sustainability.
Yeah.
So, you put yourself on the line constantly and you give a lot, which can be and is very exhausting. So it's all a learning process, and I certainly have had times when I feel like I've got it completely wrong, because your boundaries are not set as such. Your boundaries,
Mhm.
they change over time, and it depends how driven you are to reach the outcome. So for me, I originally set boundaries, but they morphed because I could see that if I wanted to get a certain project over the line, I did actually have to compromise that boundary. And this
Wow.
this idea of self-awareness and I guess self-advocacy is really challenging, because there's the theoretical view of that, and then there's the
Mhm.
practical. Well, you know, what does it mean to look after yourself, and what does it mean if your mission is around the greater good?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Wow.
it's been really interesting for me, and I absolutely have had chronic stress related to it. I've had times when I've thought, well, okay, this workload is just so enormous
Mm.
that I need to reset those boundaries. And again, that's about bringing other people on that journey and being honest about what stress looks like, what you're not coping with,
Yeah.
mental health resilience, what that looks like. And I talk a lot about mental health
Mhm.
to the children that I work with, to the high level, Ministry of Education, because it's
Wow.
and also to the trustees within Sustainable Queenstown, and anyone and everyone that I work with, because the reality is that the moment you talk about it, you realise that it's bordering on epidemic.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Wow, there's so much to unpack in
I know.
that.
Sorry, I
There
did just waffle there.
No, I love every single word of it. I am just soaking all of this up because there's so much to be said for being this activist or advocate or somebody who's in the arena of change and trying to make these things happen from whatever capacity they have, whether that's
Mm,
big or smaller, doesn't matter. It's still something. You're still in momentum. And then within that, there's the conversation around boundaries, which I would love to get into, because what does it look like to actually stand firm in boundaries or keep fighting for your cause? Because sometimes that line can get so blurred.
mm,
When are the moments that we're okay with maybe that line isn't set in India ink? It's more of the chalk and it gets erased and rewritten and it looks like something different over time.
mm,
And then there's the conversation around mental health, because I cannot imagine the all of the different facets and layers that come with being in the arena of sustainability, being in the arena of mental health and neurodiversity, and not experiencing some form of kind of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma where you're seeing these people or the world and the environment that we're living in and seeing all that's occurring on this grand scale and not feeling overwhelmed and that state of stress and the this is such a big undertaking, and you see what other people are going through and you see their stories and their traumas or their stressors and having that vicarious experience.
Mm.
How have you possibly navigated that, and what does your personal practice and conversations look like around that? Because I can only imagine the depth to which you feel and experience these things as an insider in it. So what does that look like?
Um, well, it is something that is a challenge for me because I think I am an empath, and
Mm,
so even as a child, my whole life I've definitely always felt for others,
yeah.
and that's something which I think is a great characteristic and probably why I do the
Mhm.
work that I do, but also has to be understood and managed. And so as soon as I see that in a child, I'm now very aware of, okay, well, what does that mean for that child? Because they might be kind and outward looking and they might try and please others. But as you pointed out, that's wonderful for everyone around them. But the
Yeah.
boundary for their self protection and self care can obviously be very blurred. So for me, it's an ongoing learning practice. I've developed some really interesting strategies.
Mhm.
One of which is, you'll laugh at this, is a flow chart which I have written in order to make decisions that protect myself. And
Wow.
the reason that I've done that is because I used to base decisions on, I guess, just to put it in its simplest terms, like on the greater good. Will this be a benefit
Right.
for the cause that I'm working within? And so I would base decisions on that, and that isn't really a healthy way to base decisions. And
Yeah.
I think I'm probably a slow learner when it comes to that. It's taken me a long time to learn that. So I now go through a process which I have a series of questions in my flowchart that I just check in on and go, is this for the greater good? Yes. Okay. Is this going to be something which is equally beneficial to me and self-sustaining? So things that
Wow.
probably other people do, but I have actually put in a practice around that now.
I
Um,
love that.
I also, I've everyone's got different ways that they care for themselves, and for me, I've got an incredibly active memory and
Mm.
a brain which doesn't tend to slow down. So meditation for me, I've always struggled with. I have to do it in a guided practice. I'm not very good at
Yeah.
doing it in my own space. But I
Mm.
do practice yoga and take exercise and, do all the things which are kind of advocated for us to do for mental well-being. When it comes to workload and balance, I have found a place now where I have to put myself first in terms of the balance of self care scheduled into my week so that
Yeah.
I can ensure absolutely that my mental health and well-being is first and foremost, and that gives me the clarity and the strength to then do the work that I need to do.
Yeah. Wow. So was that something that evolved and came over time? And if so, what did the conversation look like to others? So when you realized, okay, I know myself well enough to know guided meditation over silent meditation, or I need to actually schedule this in versus just hoping that I make time. Because obviously, what I'm hearing might be very different to what you're experiencing. But did there come a point where you had to have that conversation with like family or friends or people that you worked with and said, hey, look, this is where I'm at. This is what I need to do for myself? Did that conversation occur, and what did the like courage and the vulnerability look like that went along with it?
Yes, that conversation has occurred. It's a conversation that I'm quite comfortable with, even though at
Mm.
times, obviously, when you are very vulnerable, it's incredibly challenging. But I certainly don't hold any shame around it. There's no sense
Yeah.
of shame, but there is a sense of, I guess, other people's uncomfort when you have these
Yeah.
conversations.
Huge.
Discomfort, I should say. And I guess that's something that over time I've become more comfortable with, because I do sit in the margins and I do have difficult conversations.
Mm.
And I still find difficult conversations difficult. They don't actually get easier, but I'm comfortable with that discomfort, if that makes sense.
Oh, I love that.
And
Yeah.
and I still will internally, my heart rate's rapid and I come out in hives. And
Yeah.
it's not great, but it doesn't stop me from doing it, because I feel that the courage to be that voice, whether it's my own vulnerability or somebody else's, is an absolute must, and just needs to keep happening in our workplaces, in our institutions, in our schools, in our families. And
Yeah.
to be honest, I mean, it, it's so apparent in our day-to-day lives that I don't think it is taboo really anymore. Certainly not in my
Mhm.
world.
Yeah.
But how do people respond to it? I think people respond in so many different ways, and that can be challenging. That sometimes people get angry, sometimes
Yeah.
people are in denial, sometimes people are blameful, and I think when you are in that space where you're trying to set boundaries, it's really challenging to maintain that grace around
Mhm.
what that looks like, to try and signal, where you draw the line, and perhaps where other people's responsibility ties in as well. I think that's very challenging, and I don't think I've reached a point at which I would say is successful in terms of,
Right.
being a lead on that. I think I've got a long way to go, but it's a learning process, and we each try.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I find it such an interesting topic when we look at boundaries and communicating them, but then also trying to find the balance of not taking other people's reactions personally.
Mm,
Because at the end of the day, conceptually, we can understand that I am only in charge of my own emotions and my responses to them. I can't control or even fully understand somebody else's reaction.
mm,
And it can be very hard to not take it personally, especially when you're in the arena of having these bold conversations and getting into the grit of things and speaking from that place of such vulnerable truth. And this is what I know to be true. And this is the conversation I want to have. So, has there been a technique to not necessarily maybe take things personally that you have found? Like, I fully respect and understand that it's still a process and a learning, but maybe there's something in the taking it personally or taking it on board that could help more people have those conversations and maybe sit with that discomfort or lean into it a little bit more.
mm. Well, I think for me, I tend to fall on and believe in my instinct more than my practices.
Right.
And so that's not a great tool to help others learn. But I let my gut instinct guide me, and I always have done. And so
Mm,
when it comes to, those challenging moments and not taking things personally, yes, you said, it is a process, and we all have to continue to learn. But I think first and foremost is, if you see it almost like when I started the conversation of, see yourself in the third person,
yeah.
it really helps me. I can, and let's just imagine we're sitting around a table and there's some kind of confrontational conversation being had. If that confrontational conversation is often coming from a place of good within me. It's not something that is, it might be a difference of opinion of how to achieve some beneficial outcome to the community, for example, or advocating for
Mhm.
somebody that has been discriminated against. So it's challenging because there's different parties with different views, but it comes from a place of good. And if I externalize myself, I'm just one person within, a room of people that also have those same feelings and also are trying to protect themselves. So
Mm.
it's, I guess, what I do in order to cope and in order to thrive is to see the world in that way. Is I'm no more special than anybody else. We each as
Yeah.
individuals have our place, and we have to navigate that. The only downside of that approach is that sometimes I won't put myself first because I will
Mhm.
always view it as an equal member within a group, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
some people might think it's maybe not being assertive, but to me, it's always about, I guess, equity and fairness. So
Mm.
I don't think I've really just answered that question very well, but
No, I think
it's
you
it's
did.
just kind
Yeah.
of, that's how I see the world, and that third person view is helpful to me.
Yeah. But I think to your point, the most beautiful part of that answer is that it just so eloquently sums up the fact that we are all individuals and we all experience experiences and other people and reactions and emotions in our own individual way. And to know that by getting to know ourselves more and to continue the self inquiry and discovery and unraveling the different parts of ourselves to really discover what those practices look like for ourselves, that's the most important part of all of it, is what I'm hearing and what I kind of know to be true is that once we get to know ourselves a little bit more, that's when we can have those conversations, because you've obviously been in that place and okay, this is how I respond in these moments. This is the tools and techniques that work best for me. They might not work for anyone else, but this is how I navigate difficult situations or conversations.
Mm.
And to give others permission to actually explore that for themselves, I think is exactly what the answer is, really. So I think you perfectly sum that up by
Yeah,
simply sharing your experience. Yeah.
and I think also just additionally to that, the everything that I've learned in the education sector and through, and also the justice sector, because I didn't mention that we do with the Dyslexia Foundation, we also do a lot of work in the justice sector because
Of course you do.
yeah, well, because obviously a lot of our individuals that aren't achieving in schools, that are kind of set up for failure, can obviously end up in the bad statistics, as in our
Right.
prisons and in our youth justice sector. And there's been a
Wow.
huge amount of learning for me in terms of how people respond because of their communication difficulties can be
Mm.
absolutely misunderstood. So, a smirk from a teenager that's been accused of something can be read as, arrogance and
Yeah.
contempt and guilt and all manner of things. And we know this
Mhm.
on just looking at past cases, when innocent people have been found guilty, but actually were not guilty. So their responses have been interpreted in a really unhelpful way. And so what that has taught me over time is that when an individual has a response to something, we must not just make assumptions about what that means for us and our interpretation. And so I think that's been
Yeah.
a huge learning for me personally. Not to take certain responses as a reaction against something that I've said.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a thing that I've kind of been exploring lately in this kind of similar realm is when I notice myself being activated in a certain way, not wanting to use the word triggered, to respect it for what it truly is. But when I feel myself being activated, I'm like, okay, I can feel emotion coming up. I can feel things getting stirred. How am I taking their words and how am I taking their body language or their facial expressions? And rather than instantly jumping to my own conclusion, I've been really exploring this concept of help me understand. So,
Mm,
what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing is XYZ, can you help me understand?
Yeah.
And it gives them a space to say, oh, no, that's not really how I meant it. Here's what I'm trying to say. Or it says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And it helps me get really on the same page with someone, and I can hear them or see them and not just make up their truth for them and not just write their story,
Yeah.
because I have my own perceptions and I have my own stuff that's come along the way with me to infer on that conception of what they're saying or thinking. So I think that's a really beautiful reminder to have that space of, it's like a gentle compassion, and just say, okay, I'm seeing or hearing this, but what's the actual truth behind it? What's their truth behind it? So I do love that.
Yeah, and I think just giving people time and giving yourself time, but building that into conversation, it
Mm,
allows people to communicate so much better. Because
yeah.
and obviously there's a lot of research on this, but the way that we communicate and respond is instant, and not all cultures work in that way. So we know that people are already thinking about their answer before the question's been fully formed. So
Yeah.
it's about just I think building in time to practices and to all manner of communication in our institutions as well.
Do you think sometimes it comes down to this uncomfortability with silence? Because I find it quite often where I'll be in a conversation or a dialogue with someone or a group of people if I'm facilitating something, and I'm one to, like, I'll pause and formulate what I'm trying to say, or I'll be so listening to what the person is saying that I actually don't even think of my next question or think of how I'm going to respond. So then when I take a pause and when I come back into that place of, okay, let's let that digest, and now here's what I want to say, or here's how I want to reply. I often find that people want to fill the gap. They
Mm,
want to fill that silence.
yeah.
And I it's been so fascinating to watch, because I'm like, "Oh, yeah, like, I get it, but I need a pause. I need to formulate what's next." And that can make people really uncomfortable. Have you ever observed that?
Yeah, lots. And I think I can be. I'm a quick thinker, but sometimes I think I'm a slow processor. So I will actually say to
Mm,
people now, look, it's going to just take me a moment to process this. Just bear with me. And it depends
yeah,
obviously on what the conversation is and how complex something is. But I will now actually build that into my conversation, which takes people back sometimes because they're like, oh, okay, what does that mean?
yeah,
But I feel that it takes me some time to shape what I want to say, and sometimes I will, as we all do, we jump to the wrong
mhm,
conclusion because we're trying to embark in this conversation which has got like predetermined or prescriptive outcomes. Like lots of
yeah,
meetings as such, we'll start a meeting with an agenda and therefore have some idea of what the prescribed outcomes are, and that in itself for me is an issue. And it doesn't
mhm,
mean that I just want to talk fluff, but it does mean that sometimes I have to say, look, I'm going to have to take time on that and obviously get back to you, which clearly is no revelation, but it is something that I
mhm.
choose to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really powerful practice, because not only does it allow people a moment of pause for themselves to be like, oh, okay, what does she mean by that? And sometimes it actually gives people permission that it's okay to not be the quickest to react and respond with an answer.
Yeah,
Like, you don't have to have the solution in the moment.
yeah,
And if
absolutely.
we're so caught up in, okay, how am I going to help this person? How am I going to problem solve and get to the solution after they say what they say? We've missed the mark.
Mm,
And I don't think we really give people it's almost a disservice, because we can miss so much of the emotion or the depth of intellect that can come in truly listening to understand. So I think that's a really beautiful practice, and I love that you let people know and say, okay, this is going to take me some time, but I will come back to you with it.
mm.
I think that's powerful. I do have one more question for you, and I'm so, so intrigued to see how you answer this, just because of all the different
No
hats that you
pressure.
wear. I know. But it's more so because it's just so exciting because you wear so many hats, and I'm like, okay, well, what's the thing? So take your time, but when you think about our world and just the global climate in general, when you see it can be local, it can be national, global, whatever it looks like. But is there a big kind of change that you would want to make or a norm that you would want to see disrupted? And what's the one change that you would want to make or the one norm you would want to disrupt? And that's why I'm so intrigued because I'm like, how is she going to pick one?
Well, I think you might be disappointed because I honestly think the place that I've landed over all these years is exactly what you're doing your podcast on. And that is
Mm.
the ability to be an active agent, to have a sense of self and a sense of worth, because I honestly find it disturbing how many children have no idea what their sense of worth
Mm.
is, what their sense of self is. And
Yeah.
a lot of those individuals can have so many talents and strengths, but might not be strong on that kind of A-type personality communication side. So the hottest topic I think for me is for each person to learn how their individual skills can contribute for good, for an equitable and
Absolutely.
sustainable society, for their own mental health and the health of their community. I
Yeah.
think we've just got so much kind of invisible challenges that we're not even aware of in terms of how we learn.
Mhm.
So yes, that was probably, I think, the best impact that we could have societally is if we were to
Yeah.
understand our individual worth and sense of self and what we can contribute.
I love that so, so much because it's the basis of
It is the
the
basis
majority of
of
what
what
I
you're doing.
do. Yeah, and I love it.
And if I
So
was to get a second one, it would be, I guess, the farce of the consumerist dream that we've been preached.
oh,
So to disrupt that.
oh, please, like, can we just change that whole simulation that we've been handed down? Like, let's just get rid of it.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, it starts with because we have to be aware of ourselves before we can have those conversations and dig into it. So, because you've thought about this so much and it's a premise for a lot of who you are and what you do you think there's one thing that somebody could do today or tomorrow? One thing that would deepen or further their path to that self-actualization or that self-realization? Like, what's the one where does somebody start?
I think it's to question what they have been told from external organizations. So, what I
Mm,
mean by that is let's rewrite the assumptions of our self worth. So, start with the question of, well, those things that I was told, by whoever or whenever, like at school, are they true? Is that who I
yes.
am? So, I think it's about digging deep into being able to actually start with the questions, because it's easy to say self-reflection, but if we don't know what values we're reflecting on, then
Yeah.
it's very hard to measure that.
Mhm.
Our sense of self-worth is derived often by the external measures and schooling. Obviously I've got this lens of the education system, I suppose, because I work in it, but I see
Mhm.
so many of our young people looking at how they value themselves based on what they've learned about themselves through the schooling process. And for some and many, it's great, but for a huge number, it's also not fantastic.
Yeah. Wow. I could just talk to you for hours and hours and hours on end, and I do want to fully respect your time, but there's so many things that I'm like, can we just get into all of it and basically change the world because these are some big, big topics, and I love that you're not just having the conversation, but you're in it. You're so fully immersed in not only how you show up in the community, in your family, in all of the dynamics that you have relationally, but to see someone just so wholeheartedly spearhead things from a place of true activism, and not in the sense of emotional reactivity, but in the sense of I know that this needs to change on a fundamental level and then doing something.
Mm.
Words cannot even describe how awe-inspiring it is. So, thank you so much for taking this time to share these little nuggets of wisdom that I know I will be taking with me because holy, there's so many layers to go into from this. So, Esther, thank you, thank you, thank you for absolutely everything.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this podcast because I think it's got huge value to many people. So, yeah,
Mm.
thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for listening. And if there's anything at all that you want to explore or you have ideas about and want to get into, please drop me a line. You can find us at The Self Agency Advocate on both Facebook and Instagram. And I would absolutely love to chat. So let's connect.